So we continue looking at the historical Jesus, and in particular this sermon, as we have it in Matthew, also in Luke, but we're looking at Matthew's version. Today I'd like us to consider what we call verse 4. And notice that I've translated it differently than most English translations. Instead of blessed are those who mourn, how valuable to God are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. When was the last time you cried?
A little bit this morning.
And what were you crying about? How did you feel about crying? Were you alone? Were you in front of somebody? Did it embarrass you? Crying is universally an outward manifestation of mourning. And you notice the title of this message is Good Morning. We'll play on words with question mark. Now, scientists have shown that shedding tears actually reduces stress. There's a chemical change that happens. So suppressing crying is bad for you. Of course, our culture doesn't look favorably on those who cry or show any form of grief or mourning. Now, this is especially true for males, right? You guys growing up? Don't be a crybaby. Everybody ever hear that? If you didn't, brothers, you must have grown up someplace different, another planet, I guess. So before looking at the statement of Jesus, why is it that crying in public carries such negative reactions? Again, especially for men who weep in front of others. You know this famous person, right?
Yep.
That's what he said. I will never cry in public over my mother's death. This cultural attitude can be traced back to ancient Greece. I've mentioned this before. The Stoics the Greek Stoics, taught that mourning in public, even over a death of a loved one, was not only inappropriate, it was foolish. By the way, Jesus wept publicly. Guess he wasn't a very good Stoic. Stoicism has continued to influence our culture significantly. We're not aware of it as a culture, but it has. And by the way, including Judaism and Christianity. The Stoics taught showing emotion was feminine, therefore weak, and most Greeks felt that since women lacked the capacity of reason, it was irrational to cry. Besides, the divine will, or Zeus, or the goddess spirit Penthos, the word for mourn, may have caused this calamity that's forcing someone to cry. And therefore, it would be irrational or foolish to cry, right? It's a divine will. Take it like a man. Now, is this what Jesus meant? If we are mourning, we should understand it as a part of God's plan for us. Christians who believe that are really Stoics. They're Stoic Christians. So, we should not mourn, even for the death of a loved one, because it's foolish. It's really part of a divine plan. By the way, there's a big-time minister not too far from here who talked about the death of a child in his family And his dad was a big-time preacher back east. And at the funeral, he explained this to the people mourning for the death of this child, that it was like God plucking this child out because he needed another bouquet at his table in heaven.
He said,
So, should you mourn over that? Should we not mourn even our children's death because God thinks of them as a flower for his bouquet? Well, I would say absolutely not. In fact, Jesus' teaching here stands in direct opposition to this notion that human grief, suffering, and mourning is a part of some divine plan for humans. While others may think they deserve bad things that happen to them, God is affirming his care and love for us when life makes us mourn or weep. We didn't necessarily do anything wrong. And even if we did, God is not punishing us. We are still valued or honored in God's eyes. That culture didn't necessarily think that. And Jesus was confronting that. Because there were a lot of people who died. You know, the infant mortality rate in a place like ancient Israel or Palestine was incredibly high. 60% of children who lived to be 5 did not make it to age 16. 60%. So children are dying all the time in this culture. And people are mourning all this time for their children. Jerome Brown, a good friend of mine. Right. Reverend Dr. Jerome Brown. Took one of my classes when he was in his 40s at Northridge. He was a great student. After he graduated from Northridge, he went to Claremont. He got a doctor's degree. He wanted to go into the ministry. He returned to teach in our department as a part-time faculty. And he also taught in Africana Studies. Lovely brother in Christ. One day in my office, he told me a little bit of his story. He had moved from Mississippi with his mom to Southern California with 4 siblings. Jerome was the oldest. In junior high, on the way to school in the morning, he got up early and went to a roofing company and helped load the roofing trucks. On the way back from school, he stopped by the same roofing company and unloaded the trucks as a kid in junior high to help his mom raise those kids. They were from Watts. Then he worked as a roofer. Then he became a minister of the gospel. And then he got his education. Jerome had a tough life. His wife left him. Broke his heart. He had serious health issues. But I don't know if I've ever met a more joyful human being in my life.
Oh, absolutely.
One day he was jogging. Jerome in his early life was a very huge man. By the way, his son played professional football for San Francisco, defensive end. So when he had lost a lot of weight, in his 70s, he was jogging down in LA in the park. He got jumped, robbed. They beat him so bad he was in the hospital for 3 weeks. One day, he saw a neighbor up in the tree, trimming his tree. Jerome was in his late 70s. He came over to the neighbor and said, "Get down off of that ladder. You're going to hurt yourself. I used to work on a ladder. I was a roofer. Let me go up there and do it." So he talked to this guy from down off the ladder, a younger man. Jerome climbed up in that tree, up in that ladder into the tree, fell, and went into a coma, and died a month later. Now, I never heard Jerome complain By the way, I went to his funeral in Altadena. Must have been 1,000 people there. 1,000 people, all of them testifying to what a great spirit Jerome Brown was. You never would have known he had a tough life. Right to the end, he wanted to help somebody else. He had no business on that ladder. Man, I would have scolded him if I would have saw him on that ladder. That's the kind of guy he was. He had a deep love for God. Now, when he told me that story about moving from Mississippi and some of the hardship he went through, he told that story by talking about, even though there was great sadness, that he'd see his mom crying, he talked about the comfort he and his family received from God in the midst of their crying. Now, that's, I think, what Jesus is talking about. When life makes us weep, God is there to assure us of his love and to strengthen us. The word there, to comfort, means to strengthen within. Don't expect help from the outside necessarily, but God will strengthen us from within to stand against what the outside is bringing. That's the point. And so this type of comfort that Jesus is talking about from God comes in three parts. The first we've already talked about. We have the knowledge of God's abiding love for us even when we're going through a real rough time. I really appreciate what Danny said this morning based upon the verse before this. It's so true. It was a central part of Jesus' ministry in the early church. Those on the bottom of society were valued. Now, people today criticize Christianity. I hear it all the time because it protects and valorizes those in power, especially white males. That's not originally how this movement started. The Jesus movement, the church was made up of powerless people, marginalized people from every race. Sure, people have turned away from that, but that's not what Jesus' message was. The second stage of God's comfort comes from the church, brothers and sisters in the church, who minister to one another when we're down. God working within each one of you to manifest his power to help another brother or sister. How many of you here can testify in a low point, a brother or sister comes along and God's Spirit through them ministers to you and you're comforted, you're strengthened. It's real. I think you ought to come to church expecting to get something. But you ought to also come to church expecting to give something to somebody. Amen. Because you are an agent of God's healing, comforting power. Amen. Never forget that. Amen. The comforting words, reconciliation, hope in a hopeless world, acceptance of all people has a healing power that we ought to take advantage of. And thirdly and lastly, this form of comfort for those who mourn. Even though we live in an age of suffering, an age of weeping, the day is coming, according to the gospel, when that time will end. The book of Revelation says, they will weep no more. God knows the suffering of this age. And there is a day coming when that will end. When all of this will be passed away. But God's presence to comfort us is available now. Let me just close with this. I got an interesting phone call this week. A man who just referred to himself as Joseph from Nigeria. On the phone conversation, he said he had experienced and suffered through 2 wars. He was in a concentration camp for 9 months. He escaped. He's living in Northern California. And he said, in spite of all that, he said, I don't know what's wrong with American culture. This America I moved to. He says, in spite of everything I went through, I still believe in God and a God of love and hope. So we had a little talk about that. And I have to admit, he really encouraged me. To hear a brother who's been through that type of hell still talk about the hope there is in God. What impresses God, do you think? The universe that impresses people who learn about it?
Yeah.
What impresses God? I'll tell you what impresses God. It's those who are faithful, who trust Him, who are committed to Him, day in and day out. They trust God no matter what they're going through. And they rely on God. That's what impresses God. That type of allegiance, that type of trust, the type of faith, the type of loyalty. And it will also change the lives of people who see it in you in this world. Blessed are those who mourn. How honored, how valuable in God's eyes if you're hurting. He is with you for through everything and will make a difference.
Amen.
Amen.